As it turns out, there are a lot of dumb alternate history topics, or at least there are a lot more than 10. So since you all enjoyed the last time I did this, how about we talk about 10 more dumb alternate scenarios? Once again, we're gonna do this chronologically. Honestly, I get the appeal for this. You have two completely different worlds clashing with each other. As for the winner, they get to define the foundations of Europe for centuries to come. But is that really the case? Hannibal is a 1 in a million general who combined elephants with the best military mind to ever take the battlefield. Yet Rome is a 1 in a million state. Hannibal could defeat them, hell, maybe even destroy Rome itself, but he could never beat them. The problem here isn't Hannibal, it's Carthage. This scenario poses two questions. The first being, could a military expedition, detached from supplies and reinforcements at home, take down Rome as an away team? The simple answer is no. The more impossible task, however, is the second question. A more impossible task is, could Carthage take Rome's place? And even more interesting, and even more definitive, no. What used to be a Phoenician colony was now a maritime city-state with a corrupted oligarchy set on becoming a mercantile superpower. The Punic Wars showed Carthage in its prime against a Rome which was filled with dreams and ambition. This was the extent of what Carthage could do, and they bottled a naval war against an enemy who couldn't even build a fleet. And once they did, they lost it to a storm, twice. Carthage was a state that won 3 of the most decisive battles in antiquity, yet still lost the war. Making modifications in Italy or at Zama wouldn't alter the timeline in any significant way, and even if it did, it would be inconceivable to imagine Rome losing. Rome just always had the population to bounce back. Carthage, which relied on mercenaries, didn't. Rome managed to come back every single time. And it just so happened to be that the way that Rome ruled Italy was much more stable for nation building than the way that Carthage did. Carthage could never pull off what Rome did. Not in the courts, not in the battlefield, or in the sea, or in the forum. Nor could Athens, Sparta, Syracuse, or Pella. Carthage was not Rome, and it never would be. It's funny that one of the most amazing scenarios revolving around Justinian, the most popular one in fact, just happens to be one of the dumbest. Seriously, you got stuff like, what if the Black Death killed him or was postponed? What if Theodora didn't save him during the Nika riots or convinced him to focus on the East? There is so much potential here. But nah, let's do a cookie cutter impossible to achieve Roman reunification run. Why not? To be fair, Justinian had the administrative and military capabilities to get the job done. Additionally, if the reunion was to happen, this was the time to do it. It had only been a half a century since the fall of the West. So let's relegate this from being an actual dumb scenario to a slightly improbable one, on account of the fact that, psych, sorry Roma Boos, had you going there for a second, but now it's time to shatter your dreams. The Latin-speaking West, which had nowhere near the resources the East possessed, was in an abysmal state. With how defiant the Vandals and Ostrogoths were, you can pretty much take out the RE and call it for what it was, a conquest. The church divisions were already apparent, and even if Justinian didn't have an incredibly competent enemy to the east, his hold over Italy and Spain would be short-lived. And then there's the disasters. A year before he ascended the throne, the Byzantines were struck by arguably the worst earthquake in human history. The 526 Antioch earthquake wiped out 80% of the empire's third largest city. Wiped it off the map, alongside 250,000 people. That's over 1% of the entire empire's population. Just 2 years later, another, but milder earthquake destroyed what was left standing, alongside the buildings under construction. The Nika riot fires engulfed Constantinople, destroying much of it, including the church, upon which Justinian later built Hagia Sophia. In 536, the eruption of the Krakatoa volcano impacted the entire world, causing severe famine throughout the empire. If we stop here, You can easily call this one of the unluckiest reigns ever, but just when you think it's over, bam, the plague. The bubonic plague lasted from 541 to 549, and coincided with yet another earthquake, this time in Constantinople, wiping out 25 to 50% of the empire's 25 million population. This was a disaster that the Byzantines didn't recover from for centuries. So yeah, Justinian was truly S tier for coming out on top of this, despite having a bad draw. But he was just in charge at the worst time. To create a timeline where Justinian achieves his dream, we would have to reverse plagues, earthquakes, centuries of cultural differences, pacify an enemy, and break the very rules of biology just for the Byzantines to take back Rome. Sorry. So I made a mistake. The mistake of talking about World War II on YouTube. A great sin. One that the YouTube gods punished me dearly for. Oh boy, a YouTuber complaining about demonetization. What else is new? Punished for wanting to talk about World War II on a history channel. And I still want to talk about World War II, or any other topic, regardless of what YouTube says. So that's where Patreon comes in. By joining the Patreon, you get access to monthly exclusive videos whose topic is voted by you. Stuff that might never see the light of day on YouTube. Over the last year, in fact, we've built up a catalog of exclusive videos that you've never heard of. Britain and France declare war on the Russian Empire. Germany, who is allied with the Russians, declares war back. Austro-Hungary declares war on Germany, and in response, Italy declares war on the Habsburgs. The Patreon's been going on for a little bit, and I thank everyone who has contributed. Alright, self-sponsor over. Vikings. Vikings. In America. Discovering North America centuries before Columbus. You know, by accident. What if they just stayed? Could we have seen an alternate colonization of North America, but with Scandinavians instead? Well, you see, there are a lot of differences between the Vikings finding America and the Spanish. The conquistadors were backed by a centralized state, willing to invest in these new lands. The Vikings essentially stumbled upon Newfoundland, which, let's be honest, wasn't exactly overflowing with gold. Even for future Europeans who wielded far superior technology than the Norse, colonization wasn't easy. Plus, the very way the Vikings interacted with Newfoundland, or Vinland as they called it, was far different than future colonists. This was not a settlement for expanding influence. It was kind of a gathering point for resources. The barest of resources: wood, beaver pelts, and grapes. For the Norse, settlements weren't always seen as permanent endeavors. They could always be temporary, another stopping point on the sea, and if it just wasn't in the cards, they would simply leave. They weren't gonna live and die for the sake of holding some land like future European settlers would. Plus, it's important to remember that the Norse were particularly vulnerable to being absorbed by local populations, as seen in England, Normandy, and Sicily. With resistance from the locals, scarce food supplies, and distance from Europe, the Viking settlement would have been doomed from the start. Vinland would likely never have grown large enough to serve as a stepping stone for future colonies, even if the Vikings actually did want to stay there. Italia, the cradle of Roman law, seat of the papacy, home to Da Vinci, Galileo, and of course, pizza, or at least what they call pizza. Hey, why not add nationalism to the list? After all, Machiavelli's The Prince became foundational to the study of political science and realpolitik. Aren't the Italian cities a form of mini-states in themselves? Venice was able to play ball with the big boys, even taking one of them out, while the Medici founded a large part of what we consider culturally the Renaissance. Yeah, the Medici were powerful. They held Florence in the palm of their hand, and they turned it into an incredibly strong state. So why couldn't Florence have been the one to unite Italy, instead of Savoy centuries later? Well, here's the thing. Nobody could have brought all these flavors into one dish. Not even Lorenzo the Magnificent. They had to be forced together by a future Corsican general, who had a deep desire to redraw borders. Prior to the Italian republics, it was the cities, hell, neighborhoods, that formed a unique identity, one which trickled into Europe over the course of centuries. this was the only place in Europe which had rejected autocratic dynasties and papal theocracy, forging an intense level of local cultural identity. It came in many forms, but none of which we'd call Italian. Every city had distinct dialects, which others didn't comprehend, something which remains true in many places to this day. Different customs, style of government, ideologies with strong influences from the French, Spanish, Austrian, and even Arabic world. While Venetian, Milanese, Florentine, Pisan, and Sienese were the very first clear identities in Europe, ironically the Italian unification was the last and most difficult compared to the rest. While other European countries also have several regional dialects, Italy, despite being about the same size, has 30 to 40, more than the rest combined. Long story short, even to this day, Italy is still divided. It certainly wouldn't have been unified in the 15th century. So fun fact, many of you actually voted for this scenario. That prompted me to sit down and dig into the event that most people only know about because of that dumb mask. But did you know, that dumb mask almost committed the biggest terrorist attack in human history? Potentially. I mean, it didn't happen, so we don't really know, but it could have been a lot bigger than you probably thought. Remember the 5th of November indeed. It seemed like a great scenario to explore at first, but once you dig deeper, you see, Guy Fawkes, the cartoonish villain the British monarchy forever curses the name of, wasn't even the ringleader of the plot, a plot which failed due to a simple delay. So what if that gunpowder plot had succeeded? What if the plan went off without a hitch? Well, the plan was to stack 36 barrels of gunpowder beneath the British Parliament and blow it up as the king and his family were visiting. Do you know how big of an explosion 36 barrels of gunpowder can make? I do. Like, if this actually happened, it would have been like that one scene from Game of Thrones, but probably bigger. Parliament itself would be obliterated, taking the lives of King James I, his son Prince Henry, every member of the House of Lords, many from the House of Commons, even high-ranking bishops, plus potentially anything in a 2-block radius, all annihilated. This is like taking out the White House, Congress, and Supreme Court at the same time. Sounds like an event that would have major repercussions. Yeah, you'd think. The goal of the plot was to revert England back to Catholicism, and oftentimes that's kind of the overall idea for this alternate scenario. Like, destroying the government would somehow install a Catholic monarch back into power. But here's the thing, after the brutally repressive reign of Elizabeth, that ship had already sailed. Barely anyone showed support for the plot, even British Catholics. This was a group of men who wanted to commit a terrorist attack and had no follow-up. They had no plan, no backing. The only hope was that once the attack actually happened, the country would rally behind them. But I don't think that rally would ever come. Even the failed plot led to a massive wave of anti-Catholic reprisals, so really no change here. The biggest change is really the death of James I, but he would have been succeeded by another one of his many sons, while the House of Lords would have just been filled up with newly selected members. London would rebuild, like it did many times before. I mean, this isn't even close to the greatest disasters London's ever had. This ain't no Great Fire of 1666. Restoring its seat of government would be no big deal. Does the plot make England Catholic? No. Does it alter its place in the world or its standing with other nations? Not at all. Revolutions often begin with big bangs, but they need a follow-up too. They need support from within either the upper or lower classes, and this would have neither. So, let's do a 180. Let's talk about a scenario which attempts to prevent an unstoppable force by removing one small bang. So Franz Ferdinand's driver doesn't get lost in Sarajevo, and the Archduke never gets assassinated. What comes next? The progressive Ferdinand would most likely inherit the throne 2 years later, and institute much-needed reform, granting autonomy to the minority groups in Austro-Hungary. But even if he was to do that, and his military cabinet just ran with it, does that undo the humiliation of the Russo-Japanese War, the one that made the Tsar super ambitious? Do the relations between Britain and Germany smooth over after the Boer War? How about the Moroccan crisis of 1905 and 1911, which isolated Germany and united the British and French? Or the Italo-Turkish War of 1911, which saw the Ottomans lose Libya? The balance of power was quickly fading. Russia and the Ottomans were on the brink of revolution. Germany was feeling that its win streak was starting to fade, and Britain was concerned about its empire. Italy had so much to prove. In the late 1800s, alliances were in constant flux. But since Bismarck left office, they were starting to take firm shape. Every war cabinet in Europe wanted war. Above all else, you can't really ignore the two Balkan Wars, representing the biggest shift in the status quo in Europe since 1871. Not to mention, Europe was being hit by the biggest wave of anarchist movements, which claimed numerous heads of state. The arms race was on, and everyone wanted to give industrialized warfare a try, because everyone, and I do mean everyone in Europe, either felt that this was their chance to climb the ladder or preserve their place on top. It's a great point of divergence, just not one that prevents World War I. For that, you have to look further back. I actually did a video on what if Bismarck was assassinated in 1866, and that one just throws everything into chaos. So yeah, oil, the black gold, the thing every major power ran on. It was not evenly distributed across the world. In 1940, the United States produced more oil than the rest of the world combined, sitting at 180 million tons. Next came Venezuela, and then the Soviet Union. Then Indonesia, Iran, Mexico, and Romania. Germany used a very costly process converting coal into synthetic oil, which was less efficient, and it caused their deep desire for the Caucasus. The Japanese, though, had all of their eggs in the American basket. If you think about it, this means that the Sino-Japanese war effort ran on American oil. Every bomber, every ship depended on this oil trade. Hirohito had 6 months of oil in stock, so when America hit Japan with an embargo in June 1941, wouldn't you know it, Japan hit America in Pearl Harbor that December. There is no conceivable reality where Japan does not attack everything in the Pacific after the embargo. The timing of the embargo could be moved a bit, but the attack on British Malay for the rubber, Dutch East Indies for the oil, and America for naval dominance is guaranteed. Now, what you could do to change things a little bit is have Lexington and Enterprise present for the attack, or blow up the fuel tanks. But so what? The war is prolonged. Some ships from the Atlantic are moved to the Pacific. How that theater unfolds would be exactly the same. Japan's disorganized army structure and overextended economy could never compete with American production. Nobody could. America's plan for invading Japan would not be enacted for the exact same reason as in our timeline. While we're at it, as inevitable as the embargo and Japanese hostility is, the war against Germany is just as inevitable. So, you got a group of hardline communist leaders attempting to seize the Soviet government, who managed to place Gorbachev under house arrest and declare martial law. But 3 days later, the plotters failed, and just 3 months later, the Union was dissolved. Alright, so in this alternate scenario, have the coup succeed and all is well, right? The Soviet Union is saved. Here's the thing. While the Soviet Union might have been preserved, this was not the event or time to do it. 2 years earlier, Berlin had fallen. The Soviets were humiliated in Afghanistan. They lost the space race. They needed American grain to feed their people, and many republics were ready to go to war if it broke out. Most importantly, the Russian leader Boris Yeltsin stood firmly against the coup. The Russian people marched out in mass protests against them. Even the military was against this move. Imagine your whole house is burning down, and you decide to go in, hoping to save it by frantically blowing on the flames with your mouth. You stand there, cheeks puffed out, sweating profusely, yelling, "Don't worry, I got this," as the flames grow higher. That's what the scenario feels like. Making alterations to Lenin's succession, Khrushchev's reforms, Brezhnev's stagnation, the Sino-Soviet split, the Afghan invasion, Chernobyl, hell, even the space race could probably have led to an interesting scenario where the Soviets' lifespan is extended, but this ain't it. Frankly, we most likely live in a timeline which saw a prolonged, limping Soviet Union, collapsing on its last leg. Despite all of its natural reserves, it ran out of gas a long time ago. So, these last two are less scenarios and more of just templates. topics that I've done many times. I am guilty of this, and I'll keep doing it. Try to stop me. There's nothing wrong about thinking about if X empire never fell. It's a classic hypothetical. It's also not really plausible at all. Imagine every change you would need to keep the Roman Empire afloat. Yeah, let's say everything just goes perfectly for Rome. All the issues that compounded just go away, or they aren't as bad. That's great, that's perfect, but it also makes things very difficult to predict. Because what is Roman history if not just documenting the problems that unfolded upon Rome? The issues Rome faced is what shaped Rome. So to imagine a world where it all goes perfectly is entertaining, but it can't really be considered plausible. It's basically fanfiction, the equivalent of a kid just going, "I have no weaknesses, I win," which isn't how any empire or nation works, because empires have enemies, other kids playing the game too, and each player responds to the actions of every other player. If you have one empire just be perfect, it just snowballs the entire scenario, changes the world in ways that no one can predict. I wouldn't wish having to imagine this scenario on anyone. To keep track of all the players on the map and how they'd change if an empire didn't fall or things stayed the same? Oh god. I guess what I'm getting at here is that if, say, Rome never fell, we would not have a world that looked like this. A stereotypical, classical Rome, one stuck in time. We would have a Rome that would be entirely alien to us. Rome itself changed drastically from the ancient days of the Republic to its final end in Constantinople. What it even would be entirely depends on the challenges it faced. Hell, even the typical Roman soldier we imagine changed in appearance. When Rome fell, the average Roman soldier didn't look like this at all. He looked like this. Something closer to what we imagine as a medieval foot soldier. So even if we imagine a world where Rome just continued on, what Rome would even look like or act like would be completely alien, because we don't know how that empire's history would have been. Imagine if America collapsed after the end of the Revolution. Not reclaimed by Britain, but it just kind of disappeared or something. In some alternate world, you'd have a nerd imagining a world where the United States continued on, and the only thing they'd have to go off of is revolutionary America. They would probably imagine a place that we would call stuck in time. Their alternate 2024 America might be a place where men in powdered wigs would go tally-ho and fire their muskets at the British. They might imagine a United States that would become a Jeffersonian dream, because that's what the founder wanted. They could never imagine that America would ever become a military superpower, or would have cities as big as New York or LA. You get my point? My point is that if X empire never fell, even if it somehow continued on for hundreds or thousands of more years, it would not look like the empire we recognized at all. A world without gunpowder, no printing press, no electricity, steam, or nukes. A world where a major scientific discovery just doesn't happen, or an invention is never invented. Cool. What now? While I can't help myself, and will do an Empire Never Falling video from time to time, I try to avoid the whole what if X was never invented thing. I'm older and wiser now. Because what happens in a world where something isn't invented? It just isn't invented. Like, for example, a world where electricity never exists. Yes, a scenario where there is just no electricity, it is not invented. Pretty much means the last century didn't happen. What would the 20th century be like without electricity? There just isn't the 20th century as we know it. Like, what do you even say about that? It's completely unrecognizable. What if we went back further? No printing press. The very way books are created and how information is spread is entirely stuck in the days of medieval scribes copying every last letter. How do you imagine that world? It's kind of like an inverse of the last section. If an empire continued forever, it would be unrecognizable, and any era from the last 500 years without the printing press would be pretty unrecognizable as well. Now, while this sucks for realism, it does make for pretty good fiction. Steampunk worlds where steam power has become the main source of energy, galactic empires that don't use computers but people instead, or maybe you're Bretonia and just stick to the whole medieval knight thing in a world of gunpowder for some reason. You can make alterations where certain breakthroughs happen sooner or are delayed, but imagining a timeline where nobody, anywhere, at any time stumbles upon these achievements just doesn't really work. Like, to demonstrate this point, we have to look at a few different civilizations scattered across the globe, all arriving at similar discoveries. Like, Newton and Leibniz discovered calculus independently, same for Darwin and Wallace for the theory of evolution. Carl Scheele identified oxygen first, but Joseph Priestley published his findings earlier. In the 1860s, a Russian and a German both discovered the periodic table. Simply removing an inventor from the equation doesn't remove the invention, it only delays the inevitable. It's still fun to think about though. Ultimately, all these scenarios are just fun to talk about. This whole video is about nitpicking. Don't take it too seriously. Please be nice. Once again, if you want to help the channel, check out our Patreon for exclusive benefits. History on YouTube is just getting harder to do, so any contribution goes a long way to help us keep making the content that you want.